She found him on a Wednesday. Not because Wednesday meant anything in particular, not because the stars aligned or fate extended some invisible hand and pointed her toward the right door. She
Here
found
you
him on a
are,
Wednesday
fresh and
because
hot.
she had been
Smells
watching
wonderful. Thank
Greystone
you.
Hollow for 11 days, and by Wednesday she had made her decision. Vrail had learned, in the years before exile and the weeks since, that survival was not a matter of luck. Luck was what people called the decisions they made when they were too afraid to admit they had made them. Survival was a calculation, cold, precise, and utterly without sentiment. You looked at every variable. You weighed every risk. You chose the least dangerous option and committed to it completely, because hesitation was the thing that got you killed faster than any enemy. She had spent 11 days making that calculation. Greystone Hollow was the kind of town that Appalachian Mountains produced in abundance, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, old enough that the grudges were generational, and proud enough that strangers were viewed with deep suspicion, reserved for things that didn't belong. The mountains rose on three sides, green and ancient, and the towns sat in the valley between them, like something that had fallen there and never quite figured out how to leave. She had counted 14 orcs in the surrounding territory over those 11 days. None of them lived in the town. None of them were acknowledged by the town. They existed in the margins, trading at the outskirts, moving through pre-dawn darkness, conducting whatever lives they had managed to construct entirely outside the light of human acceptance. That told her everything she needed to know about her options. She had watched the townspeople with the focused attention of someone whose life depended on accurate observation. The woman who ran the vegetable stall near the old mill, Birdine, people called her Birdie, who slipped extra potatoes into the bags of the elderly without comment. The man named Boyd, 2 doors down from the carpenter's workshop, who watched the street with vigilant suspicion. A man who had appointed himself the neighborhood's unofficial moral authority. Sheriff Harker, who wore his badge like a burden he'd accepted without fully understanding its weight. And then there was the carpenter. His name was Cormac, and he was the reason she had stayed past the 3rd day. Most people in Greystone Hollow looked through orcs the way they looked through rain, aware of it, inconvenienced by it, waiting for it to pass. Cormac did not do that. She had first noticed him at the Thursday market, 3 days into her observation. He was buying salt pork from a vendor at the far end of the row, and when the vendor's cartwheel caught in a rut and the whole display tipped sideways, sending goods sliding across the cobblestone, every other customer stepped back. Cormac stepped forward. He righted the cart without being asked. He helped restack the display. He did not wait to be thanked. It was a small thing, barely worth noting, except that while he was restacking the display, a young orc boy, maybe 8 years old, clutching a coin that was probably everything he had, was standing at the edge of the market crowd, trying to see over the adults to find what he'd come to buy. And Cormac, without breaking stride, without making a performance of tolerance, stepped aside and held a space open so the boy could see. He did not look at the boy with calculation. He simply made room. The way you made room for anyone standing in a crowd who was too small to see. Vrail had filed that away. Over the following days, she built a portrait of him from observation alone. He lived in a small house connected to his workshop on the east side of Hollow Street. He worked long hours, arriving before first light and leaving after dark. He ate alone. He walked alone. The house had the quality of a place that had once been inhabited by more than one person and had not yet adjusted to the reduction. There was a woman's garden against the south wall, herbs and some late-season flowers that someone had planted with care, but had been left to grow wild for several seasons. There was a chair on the front step, built for 2 people sitting close together, that was now used only to hold a cup of coffee in the morning while one man watched the street alone. 3 years, she estimated. The garden said 3 years. She arrived at her conclusion on the 11th day, sitting in the cold shadow behind a cooperative 2 streets over, watching the thin light of his workshop lantern burn past midnight while the rest of the town was dark. He was the least dangerous option. Not because he was weak, not because he was naive, but because he was lonely in the way that made people reach outward rather than draw inward. Lonely people who drew inward became bitter, suspicious, exactly the type who saw an orc in their doorway and called the sheriff before asking a single question. Lonely people who reached outward sometimes did inexplicable things, like not looking through you, like making room. She chose the wall behind his workshop on a Tuesday night, pressed herself into the corner where the stone foundation met the old fence line, made herself as small as her frame permitted, and waited for morning. The waiting was the hardest part, not because of the cold, though West Virginia October had teeth in it that she had not fully anticipated. Not because of the hunger, though by that point the hunger was a presence she had learned to treat as furniture. Always there, impossible to ignore completely, but no longer capable of commanding her full attention. The hardest part was the discipline required to not think about everything she had left behind. She thought about it anyway. The Dragon Teeth Mountains were 200 miles northeast of Greystone Hollow, rising from the Virginia border country in ridges that the clan had called home for longer than memory could accurately hold. She had been born there, had learned to fight there before she could read, had learned the clan histories and the clan laws and the clan silences, the things you did not say, the questions you did not ask, the doubts you did not allow yourself to finish forming because halfway through a doubt was already dangerous. She had finished one anyway. It had started with a scouting assignment. Routine reconnaissance on a human settlement to the south that the war chief had flagged as a future target. She was good at scouting, quiet, observant, capable of moving through terrain without leaving a record of her passage. She had gone alone, as she preferred. The village had been called Milford, and it had been exactly what the war chief's intelligence said it was. A small agricultural settlement, maybe 200 people, no military fortifications, no standing guard, no strategic value beyond the supplies that could be seized. She had done her survey in a single afternoon and was preparing to leave when she encountered the girl. 7 years old, maybe 8, sitting in the doorway of a house on the eastern edge of the settlement, making a chain of wildflowers with the focused concentration of someone who had very important work to complete. She had looked up when Vrail emerged from the tree line, not with fear, not with alarm, but with the open curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that the world contained categories of thing that should be immediately feared. She had held out a flower. Vrail had stopped walking. The girl had extended the flower again, patient, as if the problem were simply that the large green person in front of her hadn't understood the gesture the first time. Vrail had taken it. She did not know why. The motion bypassed whatever calculating mechanism she usually ran and arrived in her hand before she had consciously decided to accept it. A small yellow flower, the kind that grew at the edge of every field in that part of the country. Worth nothing, weighed nothing. She had carried it back to the mountains anyway, and the weight of it had changed everything. The war chief had called the raid for 3 weeks later. 40 warriors, dawn assault. Minimal resistance expected, maximum seizure of winter stores. She had listened to the briefing and had felt the flower pressing against whatever she had in the place where other people kept their certainty. She had filed a formal objection, which was the first act of the sequence that ended with exile. The war chief had heard her out with the patience of a leader who had already decided the outcome. She had cited the civilian population, the lack of strategic value, the absence of military justification. He had cited the clan's need for winter stores and the historical precedent of 18 similar operations over 30 years. She had not backed down. That was the second act. She had gone to 3 other senior warriors and made her case privately. That was the third act, the one the war chief called sedition. And then, the night before the raid, she had made the fourth act, the one that sealed everything. She had found a trader who ran routes between the Orc territory and the human settlements to the south. She had given him what coin she had and a message she'd written in the trader's pidgin of both languages. The message said, "Leave." It said, "Before dawn." It said, "Do not ask questions, just go." 43 people had evacuated Milford before the raid arrived at first light. The war chief had discovered the evacuation when his warriors found an empty settlement. He had discovered its cause when the trader, caught in a shakedown 2 days later, talked. The trial lasted 4 hours. The sentence was death. Rogan had changed the sentence. She did not fully understand why, even now. Rogan was the second in command, the war chief's enforcer, a warrior who had followed orders across a career measured in decades of absolute compliance. He had pulled her aside the night before the scheduled execution and told her, in a voice stripped of everything except flat practical information, that she had until midnight to leave the territory. After midnight, he would not be able to protect her from what was coming. She had left at 11. She had not asked him why. She had not had time. But she had thought about it during 2 weeks of walking south, sleeping in drainage ditches in abandoned barns, and once in the hollow of a fallen oak tree so large she had been able to sit upright inside it. She had thought about it and arrived at no satisfactory answer. That was the thing about kindness that came without explanation. It lodged in you. It refused to be categorized. Cormac found her on Wednesday morning, the 12th day. He came around the back of the workshop at first light, carrying a splitting maul and heading for the woodpile, and he stopped when he saw her. She braced for the sequence she had learned to expect. The recoil, the assessment, the call for help or the grab for a weapon or the particular species of human rage that dressed itself up as righteous concern. He stood still for a long moment, long enough that the cold morning air moved between them and neither of them spoke. "You hungry?" he said. "Not are you dangerous. Not what are you doing here. Not the dozen variations of who gave you permission to exist in my vicinity that she had learned to anticipate from human voices. Just, you hungry." She looked at him. He was not a large man, mid-40s, though grief had a way of adding years to a face that actual years hadn't yet reached. He had a carpenter's hands, scarred and calloused and permanently stained with wood grain. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had asked a simple question and was genuinely waiting for a simple answer, not performing patience while internally calculating his escape route. "Why bang," she said. She had meant it as a complete sentence. He understood that. "Does it matter right now?" "It always matters when humans offer something." "Fair," he said. "I'm making breakfast. You can have some or not. That's the whole offer." The house was small and dense with the atmosphere of a space that had once been shared and now wasn't. She could feel the absence in it. Not the absence of furniture or objects, but the vacancy left by a person who had organized the space according to their own logic and then departed, leaving that logic intact but unoccupied. A cup on the left side of the shelf, a second chair at the table, a row of herbs and ceramic pots along the windowsill, dried now, kept in place by someone who had not yet been able to move them. She sat with her back to the wall rather than the door. He did not comment on it. He made eggs and salt pork and something that might have been a flatbread, and he put it in front of her without ceremony. She watched him take a bite of his own portion first. Old reflex maybe, or just habit. But she ate after that, and the food was plain and warm, and she ate it with the control of someone who had learned that eating too fast after hunger was its own punishment. He put a second plate in front of her when she finished. "I have nothing to trade," she said. "I didn't ask you to." "Then why?" He looked at the window, at the dried herbs, at something she couldn't see that lived in the space between his eyes and the glass. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. "I've been making too much food ever since. Can't seem to adjust the quantities." She ate the second plate slower. After breakfast, he made the offer. The spare room with the roof that didn't leak. The workshop that hadn't been properly cleaned in 3 years. Work for food and shelter. No other conditions. She said yes. Not because she had no other options, though that was part of it, but because the calculation she had been running for 11 days had already concluded before he made the offer. She had been waiting to confirm it was accurate. It was. She started that same morning. The workshop was the disorder that accumulated when someone stopped caring about the space between tasks. Wood shavings had built up in the corners to depths she estimated at 6 months of neglect. Tools were grouped by no organizing principle she could identify. Chisels nested with clamps. Measuring implements scattered across 3 different surfaces. Sandpaper and grades that had been mixed together so thoroughly they would have to be sorted by touch. A fine layer of sawdust covered everything, including a half-finished rocking chair that sat in the center of the space like a monument to interrupted intention. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at terrain before a long march. Then she started. She did not ask him where things went. She observed the faint outlines beneath the dust, the ghost shapes of where tools had lived before the neglect, the wear patterns on the workbench surface that indicated habitual placement. The workshop had its own memory. She followed it. He watched her from the corner where he'd resumed work on the rocking chair. Not constantly, not intrusively, but with the peripheral attention of someone trying to be unobtrusive about paying close attention. She didn't mind. She understood it. She was a large green woman cleaning his workshop. There was no version of this that didn't warrant observation. Around midday, he went into the house and came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one near her without comment. She drank it. It was better than she expected. 2 hours into the afternoon, she found the broom. It was propped in the back corner behind a stack of planks, and she almost missed it. But she moved the planks to sweep behind them, and there it was. A broom with a handle carved from pale ash wood, the carving running the full length of the handle in a pattern of small, repeating flowers, each one precise and detailed, and done with the patience that meant something beyond mere decoration. She picked it up. The flowers were a variety she knew, had known since childhood, the way you knew things woven into the stories before you were old enough to understand the stories were teaching you. In the orc traditions she had grown up inside, there was a flower that grew on the high ridges of the dragon teeth in late autumn. Small, 6-petaled, pale enough to look white from a distance, but gold up close if you looked directly at it. The elders called it the watch-keeping flower. You carved it on the things you left behind when someone you loved was going somewhere you couldn't follow. You carved it on the objects you trusted to the people who would keep watch in your absence. The woman who had carved this handle had not known that. She could not have known it. There was no bridge of culture that ran between a human woman in Appalachian, West Virginia, and an orc tradition from 200 miles northeast. The similarity was coincidence, or it was something that didn't have a satisfactory word in either language. But Vrail looked at the flowers on that handle for a long moment, and she felt something shift in the calculations she had been running. Some variable she had categorized as neutral, reclassifying itself as something else entirely. She carried the broom to where Cormac was working. "This was in the back," she said, "behind the planks." He looked up. Something moved across his face. Not grief exactly, but grief's quieter companion, the one that lives in your chest and doesn't announce itself, just applies steady pressure. "That was Willa's," he said. "She made it. Spent about 3 weeks on that carving. Said a broom ought to be beautiful if you were going to use it every day." Vrail looked at the flowers, thought about what beautiful things were actually made of. Not skill, not time, though they required both. Made of the decision to take something ordinary and insist that it deserved more than ordinariness. "I'll use it carefully," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then, "I know." She did not know why he said it with such certainty, but she believed it, and she went back to sweeping. Boyd arrived at 4 in the afternoon. She heard him before she saw him, the cadence of footsteps that belonged to someone who has appointed themselves an authority over other people's decisions. He came through the workshop door without knocking, the way people entered spaces they considered extensions of their own domain. He stopped when he saw her. His hand went to the wooden cross at his collar. The motion was automatic, reflexive, the spiritual equivalent of flinching. He held it without seeming aware he was doing it. "Cormac," he said. "Boyd." Cormac set down his plane. "That's an orc." But Boyd said it the way people stated facts they believed were so obvious and they constituted argument by themselves. "Her name's Vrail. She works here." The word works appeared to produce a malfunction in Boyd's processing. He repeated it to himself silently, as if checking whether it meant what he thought it meant. "You hired her." "Seems that way." "Cormac." Boyd stepped closer and dropped his voice to the register of confidential warning. "You know what they are. You know what they do. They're not like us. They don't think like us. They don't—" "She's cleaning my workshop," Cormac said. "Better than I've managed in 3 years. If that's a threat, I'll take it." Vrail had stopped sweeping. She stood completely still, not frozen by fear, but by precise calculation of how much motion to suppress so that the threat might slide past. Her hand on the broom handle was steady. She kept it steady deliberately. She had learned that stillness could be mistaken for submission, and submission sometimes satisfied the people who needed to feel their authority had been acknowledged. Boyd looked at her. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to register that she saw him, not long enough to constitute a challenge, and then returned her attention to the middle distance. He left, made sure the door registered his opinion on the way out. The workshop was quiet after that. Cormac picked up his plane. Vrail picked up the broom. Neither of them said anything, which was its own statement. The graffiti appeared that night. She saw it the next morning when she went to the woodpile for kindling before first light. 3 words in red paint on the stone wall facing the street, written in block letters with the confidence of cowardice. The statement you made at 2 in the morning when there was no one to watch you make it. Orc lover traitor. She stood and looked at it for a long time. The paint was still slightly tacky, recent. Someone had been awake in the small hours of the morning specifically to say this. That required a specific quality of feeling, not anger. Anger burned itself out too fast for that kind of sustained effort. What required midnight intention was fear. The fear of people who had decided the world had fixed walls and that her presence here was structural damage. She heard the back door open. Cormac emerged with a bucket and a stiff brush. He stopped when he saw her seeing it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Go back inside," he said. "I'll handle it." She did not go back inside. She took the brush from his hand and scraped the first letter herself. He took the bucket. They worked in the cold pre-dawn gray without speaking, removing 3 words that would be replaced by other 3 words on other mornings. She understood that much. Had understood it since the first day she had spent observing this town. But that needed to be removed anyway. Not because removal solved anything, but because leaving them there was a different statement altogether. She was the one who had seen it first. That gave her some right to the work of erasing it. When they were done, Cormac looked at the clean stone, then at her. "You have questions," he said. "1. Ask it. Why do you stay?" He considered that. The morning was cold and the mountains were beginning to separate themselves from the dark sky, and somewhere down the street a dog was conducting an argument with its own shadow. "This is my home," he said finally. "Willa is in this house, in the wood I've cut, and the joints I've fitted, and the chair she used to sit in when she read. If I leave her, and I'm not ready for that." He looked at the mountains. "Maybe I never will be." Vrail thought about that, about the things you carried that didn't weigh anything physical, and somehow weighed everything. "My people have a word," she said. "Calvin. It means the duty owed to where you grew your roots, the place that made you what you are." She looked at the wall. "I had it once, for the mountains." He didn't ask what had changed. He understood, she thought, that some questions answered themselves with silence. She went back inside and started on breakfast. That evening, after the workshop was locked and dinner was done and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, the creak of old timber, the tick of the wood stove cooling, the comfortable silence of a space shared by 2 people who were still calibrating how much of their internal weather to let into the room. Vrail said the thing she had been deciding whether to say since the afternoon. "You should know the truth of why I was exiled." Cormac set down his coffee cup. "You don't have to. You gave me shelter without asking. You should know what kind of trouble you've sheltered." So she told him about the scouting mission, about the village, about the girl with the flower that had no right to matter as much as it did, but had mattered anyway, past all rational accounting. About the message she had sent through the traitor, about the 43 people who had been asleep in their beds and were alive in their beds the following morning because of it. About the trial, about the death sentence. She told him that part clearly, without softening it. He needed to understand that what had followed her here was not the inconvenience of exile law. It was a capital judgment, commuted by one man's decision for reasons she still didn't fully understand. And the people who came looking for her would not be satisfied with her return. They would want completion of the original sentence. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "The man who changed your sentence," he said. "Do you know why?" No. But he did it anyway." "Yes." He looked at the dried herbs on the windowsill, at the ceramic pots, at the accumulated evidence of a woman who had organized this space according to her own logic and left it behind for someone else to inherit. "People do things sometimes," he said slowly, "that they can't fully explain. Not because they're irrational, but because there's something in them that knows the right answer before they've had time to construct the argument for it." He paused. "Willa used to call it the part of you that's smarter than your brain." Vrail said nothing. "You saved 43 people," Cormac said, "because a little girl gave you a flower." "Yes. That doesn't sound like something a monster does." The war chief would disagree. "The war chief can," Cormac said, with a calm finality that closed the subject and opened something else entirely. She went to bed in the spare room with the roof that didn't leak. The bed was old and the quilt was faded, and on the wall there was a small framed square of embroidery, a simple pattern of interlocking rings, the domestic craft that meant nothing and meant everything, the accumulated patience of someone who had once sat in this room and decided that the walls deserved something beautiful. She looked at it for a long time before she closed her eyes. And then she looked at the broom propped in the corner, the watch-keeping flowers carved into pale ash, the artifact of a woman she had never met, who had spent 3 weeks making an ordinary thing beautiful because she believed ordinary things deserved it. Vrail fell asleep holding that thought, but she woke before first light. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe. The wood stove had cooled. Somewhere in the mountain above the town, a nightbird was doing its late business. And underneath those sounds, the low, persistent sound of the thing she had been avoiding since the 11th day, the question of what came next. She got up. Cormac kept paper in the drawer beside the salt box. She had noticed it during her first exploration of the kitchen, cataloging supplies and resources, the way she always cataloged the spaces she inhabited. She took a sheet now and sat it at the kitchen table in the dark and thought for a moment about what she was doing. Then she began to write. She had not written in the council dialect in months. The formal register came back slowly, not the spoken orc of the mountains, but the precise language used for legal correspondence, the one that carried weight in rooms where decisions were made and needed to be made correctly. She wrote carefully, choosing each word the way Cormac chose his wood, checking the grain before committing the cut. She addressed it to the Elder Council of the Dragon Teeth Territory. Attention any council member with authority over sentence review. She stated her name, her exile designation, the date of the original sentencing. She stated that she was requesting formal review on the grounds of procedural failure in the original proceedings, specifically that a death sentence had been handed down without full council review, which was required by the law that predated the war chief's authority and could not be overridden by it. She stated the grounds clearly, without embellishment. She did not ask for mercy. Mercy was a request you made to someone's generosity, and generosity was a thing that could be withheld. She asked for the process that should have happened before the sentence was handed down. She asked for the law to be applied to itself. She wrote for 20 minutes. When she was done, she read it back twice, checking the logic of each argument, the way you check the seams of a structure you intended to trust with weight. Then she folded it, sealed it with a small amount of candle wax pressed with her thumbnail, borrowed a stamp from the envelope Cormac kept in his desk drawer, and left it on the table to post in the morning. Then she went to the window. The figure at the end of the road was still there, standing in the deep shadow where the street lamp didn't reach, not moving toward the house, not moving away, just standing in the way you stood when you wanted someone to know they had been found. She recognized the silhouette before she could see the face. Rogan. She stepped back from the window. In the kitchen, the wood stove was cold. The broom with the carved flowers stood in the corner where she had left it. Outside, the mountains rose in the October dark, green and ancient, and completely indifferent to the question of what happened next. She put the kettle on. She would need to think carefully about what came next. She had always been better at thinking when her hands were occupied, and for the first time in a very long time, she had a kitchen to think in. She did not tell Cormac about the figure in the street. Not that morning, not over the breakfast she made while the kettle worked through its slow business of coming to temperature. Not while she watched him eat and then carry his coffee to the workshop door and stand for a moment looking at the mountains the way he did each morning. The way a man looked at something that had witnessed everything he had survived and remained unchanged by all of it. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. That was partly true. The fuller truth was that she was still running the calculation, still weighing what Rogan's presence meant against what Cormac's knowing it would cost him. Information had weight. Once you gave it to someone, they carried it, and she had already given this man enough to carry. She had not expected to be here long enough for that to matter to her. It mattered to her. The workshop that morning had a different quality than the previous days. She had restored most of the order by now, the tools in their proper places, the floor swept clean to the boards, the accumulated debris of 3 years of not caring sorted and discarded and replaced by the functional simplicity of a space where someone worked with their hands and took some small measure of pride in it. Cormac moved through it differently. Not dramatically, not with any display of renewed purpose, but with the ease of a man who had stopped bracing against the corners of his own environment. She noticed these things. She had been trained to notice them. You watch people in their spaces to understand who they actually were, as opposed to who they performed being. The performance lived in the face. The truth lived in the body, in the small adjustments people made without knowing they were making them. Cormac was a man who had been diminished by grief and had not yet discovered whether he had the structural integrity to expand again. She understood that. In a way she could not have articulated to him and would not have tried. She was on her third pass of the workshop floor, catching the fine sawdust that resettled overnight, when she heard the footsteps on the front walk. Not Boyd's footsteps. She had memorized Boyd's footsteps in 2 days, their rhythm of self-appointed authority. These were different, measured and unhurried, and carrying the weight of a large body that had learned long ago that hurrying was something you only did when you were afraid, and that fear was information you did not give away for free. She gripped the broom handle and stood still. Cormac heard it too. He set down his chisel and came to stand beside her in the time it took Rogan to reach the workshop door. Rogan filled the doorway the way certain men filled doorways, not by physical dimension alone, though he was large enough that he had to angle his shoulders to clear the frame, but by the quality of attention he brought with him. He had the presence that compressed the available space in a room. The scar that ran from his left ear to the base of his throat was a pale ridge against the dark green of his skin. Old damage that had stopped being a wound and started being geography. He looked at Vrail first, not with urgency, not with anger, with the level assessment of a man who had found what he was looking for and was now deciding how much time to spend on it. Then he looked at Cormac, a different assessment, brief, comprehensive, filed, and completed. Vrail, Rogan said. His voice had always sounded like that, low and abraded, the vocal cords carrying the permanent record of the wound that should have killed him 20 years ago. You look better than when I last saw you. You saw me at my worst, she said. That was the point. He looked around the workshop, at the clean floor, at the organized tools, at the half-finished rocking chair in the center of the space. You've been busy. I work here. You live here, he corrected. The distinction was gentle and precise and cut directly to what it was meant to cut to. Cormac stepped forward, not with any display of aggression that would have been, given the relative dimensions involved, somewhat optimistic. He simply moved to stand between Rogan and Vrail, the way he had moved to the upended market cart, without making a production of it, without waiting to see if someone else would do it first. Rogan looked at him with what might have been, in a different face, mild amusement. This is my workshop, Cormac said. She works here. Whatever your business is, you can state it and then leave. My business is with her. Then you can state it here, in front of me. Rogan was quiet for a moment. He looked at Cormac with the attention of a man recalibrating an assessment he'd filed too quickly. Then he looked at Vrail. The war chief knows where you are, he said. He has known for some time. He waited because he believed distance and hunger would complete the sentence for him. They did not. You are no longer a loose end that resolves itself. He paused. I was sent to resolve it. And the man who lives here? Vrail asked. Collateral to the war chief's interest, not to mine. Rogan's eyes moved briefly to Cormac. He made a choice that wasn't his to make, by orc reckoning, but I don't make war on carpenters. How generous, Cormac said. It is actually, Rogan said without particular heat. You should understand that. He looked at Vrail again. You have time, not much. Use it to think clearly. He left. No dramatic exit, no threat delivered over the shoulder, just the steady footsteps retreating down the front walk, the same measured and unhurried rhythm as before. The workshop was quiet. Cormac stood for a moment looking at the open door. Then he closed it. Then he turned to Vrail with the expression of a man who was deciding how much of what he was thinking to say out loud. How long have you known he was here? He asked. Since this morning. And you didn't say anything. I was still deciding what it meant. He sat down on the edge of the workbench. It was a heavy motion, not physically, but in the way you sat down when you were processing something that required your full body's cooperation. What does it mean? It means the war chief isn't waiting anymore. How long do we have? She looked at the doorway where Rogan had stood. He said, I have time. He means days, not weeks. Cormac was quiet for a while. Then he said, I'm going to talk to Sheriff Harker. She almost said, don't bother. The calculation was fast and the result was obvious. But she watched his face and understood that this was not about the realistic probability of help from a human law enforcement officer in a town that had demonstrated its opinion of orc residents with red paint at 2 in the morning. This was about Cormac needing to exhaust the available channels before he could accept that they were exhausted. All right, she said. He went that afternoon. She stayed in the workshop and finished the rocking chair's third rail because the work needed doing and because keeping her hands occupied was how she kept the calculation from spiraling into territories she couldn't navigate yet. He came back 2 hours later with the look of a man who had been told exactly what he'd expected to be told and had somehow still found it possible to be disappointed by it. She did not ask him how it went. He sat at the kitchen table and she set coffee in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it. He said her legal status is complicated, Cormac said finally. He said Orc clan jurisdiction is a different system, and the town can't interfere in their internal. He stopped, pressed his lips together. He said she's an Orc. Like that was the whole argument. Like being an Orc settled every question about whether she deserved to be safe. Vrail sat down across from him. That's how it works. That's not how it should work. Should and does, she said, are different countries. I've learned to live in the one that is. He looked at her. How do you just account for that without it breaking something in you? It broke things, she said, a long time ago. What's left is what survived the breaking. She looked at her hands on the table. The problem I'm working now is different. The problem is that I have stayed in one place too long, and I have started to care about what happens to it. He said nothing for a moment. That's not a problem, he said finally. It is, she said carefully, when caring about a place gives your enemies something to threaten. That night she waited until the house was fully dark and Cormac's breathing through the thin wall between their rooms had settled into the depth that meant sleep. Then she dressed and went out through the back of the workshop, taking the alley route she had scouted in her first days of observation, moving through Greystone Hollow by the logic of its shadows. Rogan was where she expected him to be. He had taken a room at the edge of town, the lodging that existed at the fringe of every small mountain settlement, the sort of place that asked no questions because the questions would require answers better not on record. She found him sitting outside on the wooden step as if he had been waiting. He probably had been. You came alone, he said. I want to make an offer. He looked at her steadily. I'm listening. I'll come back willingly. No enforcement required, on one condition. The man whose house I've been living in, Cormac Aldridge, is left completely alone. No consequence for harboring. No collateral punishment. He made a decision based on human decency rather than orc politics. He has nothing to do with any of this. Rogan was quiet for a long moment. You think offering to return voluntarily changes the equation? I think it removes the cost of enforcement. It does, Rogan said. You're correct about that. He looked at the mountain ridge, black against the night sky. But the equation you're trying to change has already been changed by the war chief. The order isn't just about you anymore. He paused. When you hid here, when this man sheltered you and fed you and, he glanced at her, gave you my sister's broom. She went completely still. Willa Aldridge was born Willa Kane, Rogan said. Her mother was a human woman who came south from the border country 40 years ago. Her father was from the Coldwater clan. She was raised human among humans, and she never came back to the mountains. He looked at the door she had just emerged from. I knew she had died. I heard it the way you hear things across a long distance, delayed, filtered, stripped of most of its meaning by the time it arrives. He looked at Vrail. I did not expect to find her broom in the hands of a clan woman in a West Virginia workshop. The night was very quiet. The war chief's order, Rogan continued, covers everyone who gave you material support. Food, shelter, protection. The reasoning is that an example must be made not just of the traitor, but of the principle that humans can shelter orc exiles without consequence. Your carpenter has, by the war chief's reckoning, made himself a party to your treason. He looked at her. There is no version of your surrender that leaves him unharmed. The war chief was very specific about that. Vrail felt the calculations she had been running hit an absolute wall. She had constructed the logic of her own sacrifice with considerable care. She had identified the variables, assessed the probabilities, and arrived at what she believed was the cleanest solution, the one that minimized total damage. And Rogan had removed it from the board entirely. You could not sacrifice yourself to protect someone when the order specifically included them in the punishment. The only variable she had controlled, she no longer controlled. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you should make decisions based on accurate information." That's not an answer. He was quiet for a long time. The mountain wind moved through the alley between them, cold and without opinion. "Go back to the house," he said. "You have some days yet. Use them." She walked back through the dark streets of Greystone Hollow with the weight of what she'd learned redistributing itself through her body. The plan she had carried as a last resort was gone. What remained was the raw fact of the situation. She and Cormac were bound together in this, whether she wanted them to be or not. Her presence had made him a target. Her departure would not unmake it. The only question now was what they did with the days that remained. She entered the house quietly, set the back bolt, stood in the dark kitchen for a moment. Then she saw the light under the bedroom door. She had assumed he was asleep. The light was a low one, the small oil lamp he kept on the nightstand, not the brighter working light. She stood in the hallway and listened, and heard the sound of paper turning. Someone reading. She should have gone back to her room. Instead, she found herself at the window at the end of the hallway that looked out onto the small gap between the house and the workshop wall, and from that angle, in the thin fall of lamplight through the bedroom curtain, she could see his silhouette, sitting upright in the bed, holding something in both hands. A book, small, soft-covered, held with the carefulness that meant it was old or fragile or both. She stood there longer than she should have. She was not watching him. She was watching someone do the things she herself did, carry a conversation with a person who was no longer there, through the medium of the objects they had left behind. She recognized it the way you recognized your own reflection in unexpected glass. She went to bed. In the morning, 3 days after Rogan's first appearance, they sat at the kitchen table in the arrangement they had developed without discussing it. Cormac at one end, Vrael across from him, the two empty places at the sides filled by the ghosts of everyone they had each, in their different ways, been unable to fully leave. She told him about the meeting with Rogan, all of it. The offer she had made, and why it couldn't work, and what Rogan had told her about the war chief's order. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the table surface for a moment. "He's Willa's brother," Cormac said. His voice was quiet and very still. "Half-brother," her father's line, the Coldwater clan. He absorbed that slowly. She watched it move through him, not quickly, not with any visible disruption, but the way water moved through stone over time. The man who had been coming to his wife's workshop to carry her away had been connected to Willa before Cormac had ever entered this story. It was the kind of coincidence that stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something the world had arranged without consulting anyone. "She never spoke of him," Cormac said finally. "Or maybe she did and used a different name. She didn't talk much about her father's side." He looked at the window, at the dried herbs. "She always said the mountains had their own rules about what they gave back and what they kept." Vrael was quiet. "She would have wanted to know him," Cormac said. "That's the kind of person she was. She always wanted to know the people she was connected to, even when the connection was complicated." He looked at Vrael, especially when the connection was complicated. "Maybe he'll come south sometime," Vrael said carefully, "after all of this." "Maybe," Cormac said. And she could tell he meant it. That was the thing about Cormac. He did not say things he did not mean. It was one of the first things she had established about him, back in the days of observation, and it had proven accurate. He stood up, went to the small chest in the corner of the room, the one she had noticed in her first days, placed with the care reserved for things you could not afford to lose. He opened it and took out something she did not expect. An envelope, already sealed. With a stamp on it, he set it on the table in front of her. "I sent that 10 days ago," he said, "before Rogan appeared, before any of this." He sat back down. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know if it would reach anyone, or if anyone would care, or if it was a foolish thing to do." She looked at the envelope. It was addressed in his handwriting, Careful, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a time when handwriting was taught as a discipline, to the clan council of the Dragon Teeth Territory, Northern Virginia border. "What did you write?" she asked. "I introduced myself," he said. "I said I was a carpenter in West Virginia, and I had no knowledge of orc law or orc custom, and I wasn't writing to challenge either. I said I had recently employed a young woman who had shown considerable skill at identifying the things I had been neglecting." He paused. "I said she had a gift for finding the corners of a space that hadn't been looked at in years, the forgotten places, the parts that had been let go because the person who used to care about them was gone." He looked at the envelope. "I said that in my experience, a person who could see the overlooked corners of a space usually had something worth saying about what she found there. And I asked, not on her behalf, because I had no right to speak on her behalf, but simply as a man who had observed this, whether a council of experienced people truly wanted to discard someone with that quality." Vrail looked at the envelope for a long time. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No." "Why?" "Because," he said carefully, "if it led to nothing, then you hadn't been given something and then had it taken away. And if it led to something, then it would be because it was the right argument to make, not because I'd told you I'd made it and you'd had time to decide whether to hope." She picked up the envelope, turned it over. The seal was a simple one, his initials pressed into wax, a carpenter's mark on a letter to a clan council 200 miles away. The absurdity of it was also, she thought, its specific power. It was so plainly itself, no diplomatic framing, no strategic calculation, just a man who believed something and said so in the clearest available language. "You had no way of knowing if they'd receive it," she said. "No." "Or read it?" "No." "Or care?" "No," he said. "But I knew that not writing it meant I'd definitely done nothing. And I've done enough nothing in the last 3 years to know what it costs." She set the envelope back on the table. Outside, the October morning was pressing against the kitchen windows with the gray quality of a day that had not yet decided what it was going to be. The mountains were obscured by low cloud. The dried herbs on the windowsill had lost their color in the flat light. She thought about the girl with the flower, about the weight of a thing that weighed nothing. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I didn't tell you fully when I told you about the exile." He waited. "I told you about the scouting mission. About the girl, about the flower." She looked at her hands on the table. "What I didn't tell you completely was what the moment actually was." "Tell me," Cormac said. She was quiet for a moment. "I had spent my entire life being taught that humans were the enemy," she said, "not as an abstraction, as a fact demonstrated and confirmed by every piece of information I was given. And I believed it, not because I was told to. I was told many things I didn't believe, but because the evidence I had access to seemed to support it. Every interaction between my clan and humans that I had witnessed had been defined by conflict, by the ugliness that comes out of people when they believe the people across from them are fundamentally less than them." She paused. "And then this child held out a flower, not because she had reasoned through the politics of interspecies relations, not because she was making a statement, because she was 7 years old and she had a flower and there was someone in front of her, and giving flowers to people in front of you was what you did with flowers." Cormac said nothing, which was the right response. "She didn't see an orc," Vrael said. "She saw a person. And what broke something in me was not that it was remarkable for her not to see an orc. It was that for her, it wasn't remarkable at all. It was completely ordinary, the most natural thing in the world." She looked at the table. "I had been taught that the divide between my kind and yours was ancient and absolute and written into the structure of things. And a 7-year-old girl had simply not received that information because no one had thought to give it to her yet." She was quiet. "I sent the warning because of her," Vrail said. "Not because of principle, not because of honor or strategy or any of the things I told myself on the walk home to make the decision feel rational. Because I could not look at that child's face and then look at the raid order and make those two things exist in the same world without choosing between them." Cormac exhaled slowly. "The war chief found out that you warned them." "Yes. And Rogan knew why. He'd have seen your scouting report. The encounter with the girl would have been in it." She looked at him. "That's why he changed the sentence," Cormac said. "He wasn't asking. He was following the thread she had laid out and arriving where it led. Not because of mercy in the abstract, because he read your report and he understood what you'd done and why. And something in him, he stopped, looked at the window. Something in him knew the difference between treason and conscience, before he had the words for it. The kitchen was very quiet. I don't know that, Vrail said carefully. I haven't confirmed it. No, he said, but you think it. She did not answer, which was also an answer. Rogan came back that afternoon. He arrived at the front of the workshop in daylight, with the manner of a man who had finished the portion of the calculation that required subtlety and was now addressing what remained. He knocked, which surprised her. She had not expected him to knock. Cormac opened the door. I'm not here for the same conversation, Rogan said. I'm here to give you the final terms. The war chief has authorized me to offer one resolution. Vrail returns to the territory, formal trial before the full council. If the council finds merit in her argument that the raid order was itself unlawful, she can be cleared. If they don't, the original sentence is carried out. That's not a trial, Vrail said from behind Cormac. That's an execution with paperwork. It is more than you were given before. The council that would judge this case is appointed by the war chief, she said. You know what they'll find? Rogan's expression did not change. It is the offer on the table. And Cormac? Cleared of all involvement, provided he makes no further attempt to interfere. Cormac stepped forward. No. Rogan looked at him. She's not going back for a trial that's already decided, Cormac said, whatever the terms. You understand what refusing this means? Yes. You understand that what comes after is not something I can moderate. I understand, Cormac said, that some things are worth refusing even when refusing them costs something. Rogan looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man revising a calculation he had believed was settled. 3 days, he said. When I return, it will not be alone, and it will not be with offers. He walked away down the road. Cormac closed the door and turned to look at her. She waited for the fear, for the practical reasoning that should have followed. The available exits, the distances involved, the survivable options. It was what the calculating part of her mind had always done when a situation narrowed. Assess the geometry of the trap, find the gap. Instead, she felt something she had felt only once before in a doorway in a village called Milford, holding a flower she hadn't decided to accept. The sense that some decisions were made before you had time to construct the argument for them. We should talk about what comes in 3 days, she said. Later, Cormac said. Come and eat first. She almost said there wasn't time for ordinary things, that they needed to plan, that the geometry of the situation required immediate attention. But she looked at him standing in the kitchen doorway with the matter-of-fact expression of a man who believed that people should eat before they dealt with difficult problems. And she understood that this was not avoidance. This was its own position. This was Cormac's version of standing in a doorway. She sat down. He cooked. And that night, when the house had gone dark and the mountains were invisible behind the clouds, and she should have been sleeping, Vrail sat on the floor of the workshop with Willa's broom across her knees and spent a long time making sure the handle was exactly as it should be, checking each carved flower with her fingertips. The way you check the condition of things you intended to use. Not as a weapon, she was not a warrior anymore. She was the person who had spent 3 weeks learning where every corner of this workshop was, who had made breakfast without being asked, who had taken a flower from a stranger's hand and carried the weight of it for months. She was that person. And if 3 days from now that person had to stand in a doorway with a broom in her hands, then that was what she would do, not to fight. To be exactly and completely what she had chosen to become, in front of every person who had decided what she was supposed to be. The night moved through its hours. The mountains waited. The third morning arrived without ceremony. No shift in the mountain air that distinguished it from the 2 mornings that had preceded it. The October dark thinned at the edges of the sky the way it always did. Reluctantly and without apology, and Greystone Hollow assembled itself out of shadow the way it always did. And if the world knew what the day contained, it gave no indication of that knowledge. Vrail had not slept. She had sat on the workshop floor through the deep hours of the night and into the gray approach of morning, and she had been still. Not the disciplined stillness of someone suppressing movement for tactical reasons. Not the coiled, calculating stillness of someone assessing variables. just still. The way water was still when nothing was moving through it. She had thought about the girl with the flower, not strategically, not as the origin point of the sequence that had led here, just as herself, a child sitting in a doorway with a chain of wildflowers in a completely uncomplicated generosity that had no context and needed none. Vrail had spent the intervening months constructing meaning around that moment, layering interpretation over it, the way sediment layered over something buried. But in the dark hours of the third morning, she had stripped all of that away and let it be what it actually was. A small girl, a small flower. The smallest possible unit of the belief that the person in front of you was worth something. She heard Cormac's door open at 5:30. He came into the kitchen without speaking and put the kettle on and stood at the window with his back to her, looking at the place where the street disappeared into morning dark. She watched him from the workshop doorway. He was dressed in his work clothes, the heavy canvas trousers and the flannel shirt that had faded to the color of old cedar, the leather apron he wore when doing fine work. He had shaved. She noticed that. In 3 weeks, he had not always shaved before starting the day. He had today. She went to the window and stood beside him. The street was empty. For another 20 minutes, it stayed empty. They drank their coffee. The kettle's heat moved through the kitchen, and the wood stove ticked, and somewhere above the cloud layer, the sun was conducting its own business with complete indifference to what was happening in the valley below. Then the light at the end of the street changed, not because the sky was brightening, because there were torches. She counted them as they came into view. 12 orcs, moving in the loose formation of a group that was not trying to be subtle, not the disciplined column of an organized assault, but the spread of people who had come in sufficient numbers that subtlety was no longer relevant. Rogan was at the front. Behind him, she recognized 2 warriors from the Dragon Teeth Council's enforcement unit. The others she did not know by name but recognized by type. The clan members who came to these things because they had been told to come and because not coming was its own category of statement. Cormac set down his coffee cup. "Ready?" he said. She picked up Willa's broom from the corner where she had left it the night before. The carved handle was smooth under her hands. She had run her fingertips over every flower in the dark hours of the morning, checking the grain, the depth of each cut, the places where Willa's tool had pressed hardest. She knew it now, the way she knew terrain she had scouted carefully. Every variation, every place where the wood had its own opinion about the direction of the carving. "Ready," she said. They went out the front door together. The morning air was cold and carried the smell of wood smoke from the early risers on the street above and the damp mineral smell of the mountains after a night of low cloud. Vrail stepped off the front walk and stood on the road and felt the cold ground through the soles of her boots and thought about roots. About the word kalven, she had tried to explain to Cormac in the early days. The duty owed to where you grew your roots. The orc formation stopped 30 feet from the door. Rogan looked at her, at Cormac, at the broom she was holding. His expression had the quality of someone who had prepared for several scenarios and was now identifying which one had arrived. "Last offer is off the table," he said. "I know," Vrail said. "Then you understand what this is." "I understand what you've been sent to do," she said. "I'm not sure you understand what you're doing." Something moved at the edge of her vision. Boyd, standing in the gap between his house and the workshop wall, holding the crossbow he had pressed on Cormac 2 days ago. He was wearing his coat over his nightclothes, which meant he had come out fast, which meant he had been watching for this. His jaw was set with the expression of a man who was frightened and had decided to be there anyway, which was the only courage that actually counted. Bertie stood 3 houses down. She had her canvas market bag in one hand and a look on her face that said she had come out early to watch what happened and intended to remember it accurately. Others, not many, but present. Rogan saw them, made the assessment, did not change his posture. "The war chief's order covers everyone in this house," he said. "You know that." "I know it," Vrail said. "Then you know there's no version of today that ends well for you by standing here." "I'm not standing here for a version that ends well," Vrail said. "I'm standing here because this is where I live, and because the people behind you deserve to hear something before anything else happens today." Rogan was quiet. She did not wait for permission. Permission was not the relevant concept. She spoke in orc, not because she was excluding Cormac. She would tell him everything afterward, every word, every inflection. But because what she needed to say needed to land in the language it was meant for, without the distance that came from speaking across a linguistic boundary, she spoke to the warriors behind Rogan. She said, "I want to tell you about a girl I met in a village called Milford." She told them the full version, unedited by the need to make herself look better or worse than she was. The scouting mission, the afternoon reconnaissance, the edge of the settlement where she had come out of the tree line at the wrong moment and found herself standing 10 feet from a 7-year-old child who should have run and instead had extended a wildflower with the confidence of someone conducting perfectly normal business. She described the flower, the exact yellow of it, the way the child held it out patiently for the second time when Vrael had not immediately responded, as if the problem were simply one of comprehension rather than paralysis. She described taking it, the motion that bypassed everything she had been trained to be. She described carrying it back to the mountains, the weight of a thing that weighed nothing. The warriors behind Rogan were listening. She could see it in their stillness, not the aggressive stillness of people bracing for action, but the different stillness of people being asked to hold something unfamiliar and finding, against expectation, that it had weight. Then she asked the question. She said, "Who here has a daughter?" 3 warriors shifted. Slight movement, involuntary, the body answering before the mind could decide whether to. She said, "If your daughter went on a scouting mission and she saw what I saw and she did what I did, saved more than 40 lives because a child gave her a flower and she could not make those two things exist in the same world without choosing between them, what would you want the war chief to do with her?" Silence. The torches burned in the morning air. The mountain above the town was beginning to separate itself from the cloud as the light increased, pale green slopes emerging from gray, like something surfacing from deep water. One of the warriors in the back, older, carrying a scar across his forearm that had the pattern of a defensive wound, lowered his torch until it pointed at the ground. A small motion, no announcement, just a torch at a different angle. Rogan watched it happen, and then something else happened. Something that had not been in anyone's calculation. Movement at the far end of the street, coming from the direction of the North Road, the road that came down from the mountain pass, the only approach from the Dragon Teeth territory. A single figure walking at the pace of someone who had been walking for a long time and had arrived exactly when they intended to. Female, gray-braided, carrying no visible weapon. Moving through the scattered edge of the orc formation with the ease of someone for whom the crowd was not an obstacle, but an audience. Elder Wren. She was smaller than Vrael remembered from the stories. The elders always were. Memory inflated them, gave them the dimensions of their authority rather than their bodies. But she moved with the weight of a woman who had spent 60 years deciding what mattered and had refined the list to the essential items. She walked through Rogan's warriors the way water moved through stones. Not forcing, just finding the available path and taking it. She stopped between Vrael and Rogan. She looked at Vrael for a long moment, then at Cormac, then at the broom. "The carved handle," she said in English. Her accent was heavy, but the words were precise. "Watch-keeping flowers." "Yes," Vrael said. "Who carved them?" "A woman named Willa. She didn't know the tradition. She just believed a broom should be beautiful." Wren looked at Cormac. "Your wife?" "Yes," Cormac said. "She studied him with the assessment of someone who had been reading people at speed for 6 decades. I received 2 letters," she said. "Vrael's arrived 6 weeks ago. When a clan member writes to request council review of a death sentence, the correspondence eventually finds the right desk. Slowly, but it finds it." She reached into the fold of her traveling coat and produced a second envelope. "This one I did not expect." She held it out. It was addressed in Cormac's careful handwriting. "I read it 3 times, Wren said. Not because it was complicated, because it was simple in a way that is rare. Most people who argue for someone's life argue the principles, the justice of it, the precedent, the procedural failures." She looked at Cormac steadily. "You argued the corners." "It was the truest thing I knew about her," Cormac said. "It was," Wren said, "and truth delivered plainly in someone else's language, by someone with no stake in the outcome." She paused. "That is an argument very difficult to dismiss." She turned to face the assembled warriors. She did not raise her voice. She had, Vrael understood, never needed to. You were sent here by a war chief's order, she said in Orc now, clear and unhurried. I am not here to contest the war chief's authority in matters of clan security. I am here because the Elder Council has a prior and superior authority in matters of clan law, specifically in matters where a death sentence was handed down without full council review. She looked at Rogan, which this one was. Rogan said nothing. The original sentence was reduced without authorization, Wren continued, by someone who had the rank to make that decision in the field, but should have referred it back to the council for formal review. He did not. She looked directly at Rogan, because he believed the original sentence was wrong, and he was correct to believe that. The morning was very quiet. This raid Vrail spoke against, Wren said, the one that resulted in her exile. How many warriors did we lose? Rogan's jaw was tight. None. And how many civilians died? 27. Including children? Yes. Wren nodded slowly. She looked at the warriors, at the torches, most of which were now angled low or resting against legs or ground. Vrail was right to speak against it. The war chief was wrong to order it, and the sentence handed down was not law. It was retaliation dressed up as law. She paused. Those are different things. We do not serve the clan by confusing them. She turned to face Rogan fully. Rogan Kane, she said, his full name, the name of the border country family his mother had come from. The name that was also, Vrail now knew, the name Willa had carried before she became Willa Aldridge. You have been carrying this alone for 8 months. Why did you not bring it to the council? Rogan's jaw was tight. The war chief would have contested any council review. Probably, Wren agreed. That would have been his right, and the council would have heard both arguments and made a determination. That is how the law works. Not, she gestured at the torches, at the assembled warriors, at the whole architecture of what Rogan had been sent here to do, this. A long silence moved through the street, and then Rogan did something Vrail had not predicted. Not in any version of the calculation she had run, in the long weeks of running it. He turned to the warrior nearest him and took the torch from that warrior's hand, set it on the ground, stamped it out with one deliberate motion. Then he unbuckled the axe from his belt, the axe he had carried for 20 years, the one with the clan mark etched into the haft, and he set it on the ground beside the extinguished torch. Not thrown down, not dropped, placed, with the deliberateness of a man setting down something he had been carrying for longer than it was healthy and had finally found a surface solid enough to trust with the weight. He straightened up. I read her report, Rogan said. He was speaking to Wren, but his eyes moved to Vrail for a moment and held there. The full scouting report from Milford. Every detail, the reconnaissance findings, the tactical assessment, and the anomaly at the end that she had written and then partially crossed out and then written again, because she couldn't decide whether it was relevant. He paused. A child, a flower, the exact yellow of it, the crossed out section. She had forgotten that she had crossed it out and rewritten it. She had told herself it was because the information was tactically irrelevant and then included it anyway because something in her had refused to let it be erased. I signed the enforcement order for the raid, Rogan said. My name is on that document. 27 dead. I carried that. I still carry it. He looked at Wren. When the death sentence came down, I told myself I was following procedure. That the law was the law and my personal feelings about the specific case were irrelevant to the proper administration of justice. He looked at Vrail, and then I read the report again, the crossed out section, the flower, and I understood that she had done what I had not done. She had looked at the report and looked at the order and chosen between them, and she had chosen correctly, and I had not. He looked at the ground where the axe lay. I commuted the sentence because she was right, he said. Not because I had the authority to do so unilaterally, not because I had constructed a legal argument that justified it, because she was right and the war chief was wrong, and I had spent 20 years following correct procedures toward incorrect ends, and I was done with it. He looked at Wren. You can bring whatever disciplinary action the council deems appropriate. I'll stand for it. Wren looked at him for a long moment. The council's view, she said carefully, is that a commander who commutes an unjust death sentence on his own authority is guilty of a procedural violation, and that a commander who reads a field report, understands what it means, and finds a way to preserve the life of someone who was right. She paused. is exactly the kind of commander the clan needs more of. She turned back to the assembled warriors. The Elder Council is revoking the exile order on Vrail of the Dragonteeth clan, effective this morning. The grounds are procedural failure in the original sentencing and substantive merit in the underlying argument against the Milford raid. Any warrior who wishes to contest this ruling may do so through the formal council review process. No one moved. The older warrior with the defensive scar on his forearm had been standing with his torch angled at the ground for several minutes. Now he set it down entirely. The motion was quiet and it moved through the group not contagiously, not an imitation, but because it gave the rest of them a visible form for what they had already decided. One by one the torches went down. Ren turned to Vrail. "You have a choice," she said. "Return to the territory. Your exile is revoked and your standing in the clan is restored. Or remain here. We don't require your presence in the mountains, but the council would benefit from yours." She paused. "There is work to be done. The work that requires someone who has lived on both sides of the line and understands that the line is mostly imaginary." Vrail looked at Ren, at Rogan, standing with empty hands and the look of a man who had put down something heavy and didn't yet know what to do with his arms. At the warriors dispersing slowly, the emergency of the morning dissolving into the ordinary gray of a West Virginia October day. At Cormac, he was looking at her with the expression he wore when he was not going to say anything, because he understood this was not his decision to carry. He had the crossbow Boyd had given him, held loosely at his side, pointed at nothing. He had shaved this morning. He had come out and stood beside her with a weapon he barely knew how to use, in his work clothes, because that was who he was. The man who stepped forward when the cart tipped, who made room in the crowd, who wrote letters about corners to orc councils 200 miles away. She knew what her answer was. She had known it, she thought, since the night she had watched his silhouette through the bedroom curtain, holding his wife's journal, carrying a conversation with someone who was no longer there. "I'll stay," she said, "but I'll come to the council sessions. Whatever work needs doing that I can do from here, I'll do it." She looked at Ren. "The things that need changing, they won't change quickly. They'll need someone with patience for slow work." Ren's expression did something that was not quite a smile but contained its ingredients. "You've been cleaning workshops," she said. "I think you understand slow work." "I do," Vrail said. Ren nodded once. She looked at Cormac. "You wrote that a person who could see the forgotten corners of a space usually had something worth saying about what she found there." She glanced at the workshop behind him, at the clean windows and the organized tools visible through the glass. "You were right." She turned and walked back up the north road toward the mountain pass. Rogan fell into step beside her after a moment, not quite alongside her, a half step behind, the position of someone who was no longer certain of his rank and was navigating the uncertainty with what dignity remained. Some of the other warriors followed. Others drifted in different directions with the aimlessness of people whose mission had dissolved and who hadn't yet identified what came next. The morning went on about its business. Boyd was still standing in the gap between the buildings, crossbow in hand, wearing his coat over his night clothes, looking at the space where 12 orc warriors had been standing a minute ago. He looked at Cormac. He looked at Vrail. He did not say anything. He touched the cross at his collar, his habitual gesture, the instinctive reach for the solid and the certain. But this time his hand didn't stay. It dropped back to his side. He stood for a moment in his nightclothes in the cold morning, and then he walked back into his house. Bertie, 3 houses down, had watched all of it with the expression of someone filing things away for accurate later recollection. She met Vrail's eyes. She nodded once, not enthusiastically, not with any display of solidarity. Just the nod of a woman who had seen what she had come to see and found it satisfactory. Then she went back inside. Cormac set the crossbow down against the workshop wall. They stood in the road for a moment. The street was empty now. The last of the cloud was lifting from the mountain above the town, and the slopes were coming clear in the early light. That Appalachian green that had no equivalent anywhere she had been. The color of a place that had been growing things for longer than anyone could accurately remember. "That was Willa's brother," Cormac said quietly. "Half-brother." He put his axe down. "Yes. Because of her report," Cormac said. "Because of the flower. Because she wrote it down and crossed it out and wrote it again and he read it and he understood what it meant. He was quiet for a moment, and then he let you live. And everything that followed from that. Vrail looked at the extinguished torch lying in the road, the small black mark where it had burned against the stone. One thing led to another, she said, the way things do. He was quiet for a moment longer. She would have wanted to know him, he said again, softer this time. Not as information, but as something he was keeping. She had this belief, Willa, that the world was smaller than it looked, that the people who mattered to you were usually already connected to each other in ways you hadn't discovered yet. He looked at the North Road. Maybe she was right. Maybe, Frail said. Come inside, he said. I'll make breakfast. She picked up Willa's broom from where she had set it against the doorframe. The carved flowers were cool under her fingers in the morning air. Watch-keeping flowers. The flowers you carved on the things you left in the care of someone you trusted. She followed him in. 6 months passed. The way good months passed. Not quickly, not without difficulty, but with the accumulating weight of time that was being used for something rather than simply endured. Greystone Hollow did not transform. It was not that kind of town, and transformation was not that kind of process. What happened was slower and more durable than transformation. What happened was adjustment, the incremental adjustment of people deciding, one small choice at a time, what kind of place they wanted to live in. Bertie left vegetables on the workshop step twice a week. She never said much. The vegetables said it for her. Boyd stopped touching his cross every time he saw Vrail in the street. He did not stop being suspicious. Some dispositions were too long practiced to simply dissolve, but he channeled it into a watchfulness that was, she had decided, not entirely without value. A neighborhood that nobody was watching was its own kind of problem. Sheriff Harker came by the workshop 3 weeks after the morning confrontation, turned his hat in his hands for an uncomfortable moment, and said that he thought perhaps the jurisdictional question regarding ORC residents warranted a second look. She thanked him without excess warmth and let him feel the discomfort of his own insufficiency. Some things should not be too easily resolved. She traveled to the mountains 4 times in those 6 months. Each time she went up the North Road and into the territory that had been home and was now something more complicated than home, carrying in her head the accumulated observations of someone who had spent months living the things she was supposed to be theorizing about. Each time she came back to Greystone Hollow and came through the door of the workshop and found Cormac at his workbench and felt the rightness of returning to a place that had kept itself intact in her absence. Rogan had remained in the mountains. He had stood for the council's procedural review, as he said he would, and the council had treated him with the moderate severity appropriate to a man who had done the wrong thing correctly. He was no longer enforcement commander. He was working with Elder Wren on the review of the raid authorization process. She heard about it in fragments, the way you heard about the ongoing work of people doing slow and important things from a distance. It sounded like the work that would take a long time and would matter. On the last trip, in the final week of February, Cormac had pressed an envelope into her hands before she left. She had recognized it immediately. His careful handwriting, the clan council's address in the Virginia border country, a different letter than the one before, but written in the same voice. She had carried it up the mountain pass and delivered it to Elder Wren in person, and Wren had read it at the table in the council hall while Vrail sat across from her, and when she finished, she had set it down and looked at Vrail with the expression of someone confirming a conclusion she had already formed. He writes as a man who has learned something, Wren said. He has, Vrail said. We both have. On the first morning of March, with the winter beginning its reluctant retreat from the valley and the mountains showing the first thin haze of green that meant another spring was arriving, whether you were ready for it or not, Vrail stood before the full Dragon Teeth clan council for the first time. She had prepared for 3 weeks. Not the preparation of someone afraid of the audience, though some of that was present. The preparation of someone who understood that words directed at institutions had to carry more weight than words directed at people because institutions absorbed impact differently. You had to account for the distribution. She presented a 12-point proposal for a new operational code governing interactions with civilian populations. Not a polemic, not an argument about the fundamental ethics of everything the clan had done for 30 years. A practical document, specific, measurable, built on the cases she had observed in the months she had spent living between the two worlds the clan had always treated as categorically separate. She cited Corners, the workshop principle, that the worth of a space was not determined only by the central, visible, well-lit parts of it, but by what was happening in the places that hadn't been looked at in a while. She cited the girl, not strategically, because the girl was the beginning of everything and deserved to be named at the beginning of everything. The council deliberated for 2 hours. The vote was 8-3. Wren told her afterward, walking out of the council hall into the thin March sunlight on the ridge, that the 3 opposing votes were not entirely without merit, that the balance between clan security and civilian constraint was genuinely complex and would require ongoing calibration, and that anyone who told you institutional change was straightforward was selling something. But 8-3 was a beginning, and beginnings were what you built from. She walked back down the mountain and through the pass and down the North Road into Greystone Hollow with the tiredness of a person who had completed something that needed completing. Not elated. Tired in the productive way. The way you were tired after work that used the right muscles for the right purpose. She came through the workshop door at 7:30 in the evening. The smell reached her before anything else did. Cormac was in the kitchen, not sitting at the table, not drinking coffee, standing at the stove, the sound of something in the skillet, the smell of onions and pork, and something she identified after a moment as the dried rosemary from the pot on the windowsill that had been Willa's and that Vrail had quietly been tending since the fall. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. He heard her and looked over his shoulder. His expression was the expression of someone who had planned something and was now slightly self-conscious about the fact of having planned it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He set 2 plates on the table. Pork with onions and rosemary, bread from Bertie's morning delivery, a small jar of something amber-colored that turned out, when she tasted it, to be apple butter made from the old tree behind the cooperage that no one had claimed for years, and that Vrail had quietly harvested in October, working in the early mornings before the town was fully awake, filling 2 large jars that she had left on Bertie's step without comment. She did not ask where he had gotten the apple butter. Some things were better as evidence than as explanation. They ate. He asked about the vote, and she told him. He asked about Wren, and she told him. He asked about Rogan, and she said he was doing the slow work well, as far as she could tell, and that slow work done well was the only kind that lasted. After dinner, he went to the small chest in the corner. She watched him open it, the chest where he kept the things he could not afford to lose. He took out 2 items. The first was a small wooden box, not much larger than his 2 hands set side by side. He had made it himself, she could see that. The grain was ash wood, the same pale ash as the broom handle, and the lid was carved with the watchkeeping flowers. Each one precise and individual, done with the patience of someone who had spent considerable time making an ordinary thing into something that deserved more than ordinariness. He set it on the table in front of her. She opened it. Inside was a booklet of folded pages, hand-stitched along one edge. She opened it and recognized Willa's handwriting, the careful, disciplined script she had seen in the journal. But the pages were not original. They were copies written in Cormac's hand, letter by letter, reproducing Willa's script as closely as he was able. Not perfectly. His hand was a craftsman's hand and Willa's had been finer. But the attempt was visible in every line, the care of someone not trying to deceive, but trying to honor. The last entry was there, the full text of it. Under the booklet, on the bottom of the small box, was a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. It said, "You told me that in your tradition, the watchkeeping flowers meant the duty owed to what you leave in someone else's care." Willa carved them without knowing that. I think she knew it anyway, in the way she knew most things, before she had the words for it. She left this house in my care when she went. I have not always kept it as well as I should have. You showed me how to look at the corners again. I am grateful for that more than I know how to say. So I will say the small thing instead. You made this place a home again. Whatever that is worth to you, it is everything to me. Cormac. She held the paper for a long time. She thought about the first morning, the bowl of stew set in front of her without ceremony, the second bowl that followed the first without being asked for, the spare room with the roof that didn't leak, and the quilt that was faded, and the embroidered rings on the wall that someone had put there because walls deserve something beautiful. She thought about the broom, about the girl, about the flower that weighed nothing and changed everything. She thought about the vote, 8-3. Not the end, but a beginning. The way all real things began. Not with a single dramatic gesture, but with the slow accumulation of small corrections, small recognitions, small decisions made by people who were tired and afraid and chose to do the right thing anyway because they had run out of good reasons not to. She thought about Rogan standing in the road with empty hands. About Boyd in his nightclothes holding a crossbow he was frightened to use. About Bertie's nod, that single unhurried acknowledgement that meant she had seen and would remember, and that was its own form of protection. She folded the paper and set it back in the box, set the bomb on the table between them. The council approved the proposal, she said, 8-3. I know, he said. You told me. I know you know. She looked at the box, at the carved flowers. I wanted to say it again, because the first time I said it, I was tired. And it deserves to be said when I'm not tired. He nodded. 8-3 is not the end, she said. It is a beginning. There is a way from a vote to a change in what people actually do. The distance between a resolution and a practice is where most things die. She paused. I intend to spend considerable time in that distance. I know, he said. It will require more trips to the mountains, more time with the council, more of the slow work. I know. You'll be here. He looked at her steadily. I'll be here. She looked at the broom in the corner, the watch-keeping object that a woman had made without knowing what she was making, because she had believed that ordinary things deserved more than ordinariness, that the tool you used every day should be beautiful, that beauty was not reserved for the significant moments, that the floor needed sweeping, whether the world was watching or not, and the sweeping was worth doing well, and the broom was worth making beautiful, and the person who would hold it was worth trusting with the things that mattered. In the morning, Vrail said, I'll need to sweep the workshop. It's been 3 days. The corners especially, Cormac said. The corners especially, she agreed. She closed the box and held it carefully in both hands, the way you held something made for you by someone who had measured it to fit. Outside, March was doing its slow work on the valley. The mountains were beginning their annual return to green. The creek behind the cooperative was running high with snowmelt from the peaks, and somewhere in the street a dog was conducting its nightly argument with the dark, and the old timber of the house was settling with the sounds of a structure that had stood long enough to know its own voice. In the kitchen where Willa had once stood reading while spring came through the window, where Cormac had sat alone for 3 years in the grief of a man who had stopped being able to imagine what came next, where an orc exile had eaten a bowl of stew and tasted something that felt unreasonably like the beginning of something. They sat together while the night moved through its hours and the mountains kept their patient watch and the valley settled into sleep. Some things changed slowly. Some things changed because a 7-year-old girl sat in a doorway with a flower and held it out to a stranger without fear. Some things changed because a man who had forgotten how to live looked at the corners of a room he'd stopped seeing and understood what was missing. And some things changed because one person sat down across from another and chose, not dramatically, not with any grand announcement, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had run the calculation and arrived at the only answer that made sense: to stay. The broom was in the corner. The corners would need attending in the morning, and she would be there to attend them.